This week, we're going to cover enumeration and system exploitation. Now, you may have already started diving into some of the coursework, but we're going to do a brief overview of what is enumeration and system exploitation to get you started this week if you haven't already started diving into the coursework. So when we talk about exploitation or system exploitation, typically there are four areas where we're going to talk about. And the one is how the bad guys get into an organization in the first place. How does malware get on a system to begin with? Well, that happens a lot via phishing. So phishing is when you send an email with either malware or some kind of link that is going to allow the person, well, the hacker in this case, to get into the system. And the way it does that is malware takes advantage of actively exploiting vulnerabilities. And one of the ways that when you're performing hacking, if you're doing ethical hacking, is we verify if vulnerabilities are accurate. So after we run a Nessus scan, after we've looked at things with Nmap, we want to verify that the vulnerabilities we found make sense. And then there's also brute force attacks and password hacking. We'll cover a little bit of that. So let's start with how someone might generate a phishing email. So here's an example of how that might be done. This is the social engineering toolkit. This is an open source toolkit that anyone can download and use, and it lets you create all kinds of different phishing attacks. So you can see spear phishing attack vector. You could create an infectious media. And when we talk about media, generally we're talking about CDs or flash drives. You could create malware on that would link back. There's some PowerShell attack vectors. This software will actually go out. You can set it up. It will create all of the hacking for you. It will create the specific malware that you can use and inject. And there's an example you can see on the screen of embedded in PDF files or Word files. So this is a tool that's, again, freely available. Anyone can download and use this tool. Now, again, you shouldn't do any hacking on any systems you don't own or don't have some kind of signed permission to do, because that would be illegal. It'd be like breaking in to someone's house. Now, after phishing happens, generally when we're talking about hacking or even ethical hacking, this is what our network looks like. Normally, we are the person, we got into one computer, say the hacker has now gotten into a network through the firewall and they're on at least one computer in the network. Now they can begin hacking and looking at how they can use their position to start compromising more devices. Now, when we talk about network exploitation tools, there's a lot of different tools. We have Metasploit. We've already been introduced to Nmap. We have Hydra, Ettercap. We have programming languages such as PowerShell, Python, Go, C++. And I mentioned PowerShell because even though it's not a programming language, as you would typically think of a programming language, it's still very used for hacking and exploit development. This week, we're going to be talking a lot about Metasploit, and for most of the remainder of the course, that's going to be our key focus. We'll look at Metasploit, we'll look a little bit at Wireshark, and a little later, not this week, but in a couple weeks, we'll be looking at John the Ripper and hacking password cracking tools as we look at cryptography. Now, when we talk about exploits, when exploits first were introduced on the scene, and I guess first I want to go over what the idea of an exploit is. So you hear cybersecurity professionals talk about exploits a lot, but all an exploit is a piece of code. So think of someone wrote a Python script, they wrote a PowerShell script, some kind of code that is just taking advantage of a flaw in a different piece of software. That is what an exploit is. We call those single exploits. Now, when we first had what was the beginning of exploit development, it was very expensive and difficult to make an exploit. So basically, if you go out on something, ExploitDB is a great example. It's a database of exploits. You can actually see single examples of various exploits, and you'll see an entire exploit is written in PowerShell and is very specific to that one exploit. So the payload and executable, everything is written in one. So there's this one piece of code or program that's designed to hack into a system, and then after it gets access, it's then going to do a specific task. So in our case, maybe after the malware runs, after the exploit runs and installs malware, maybe our malware is going to give us a backdoor into the system. Maybe it's going to do that by creating a user account with a specific username and password. Well, this made it so exploits were not very customizable. It was really difficult to coordinate and use exploits within organizations. So Metasploit was developed as an open source exploitation framework. It allows for separating exploits and payloads. So now you can have an exploit that takes advantage of the specific flaw, and then you can have all kinds of different payloads. So if you want a payload after exploiting a device that's going to install a new user account, if it's going to dump passwords, if it's going to install ransomware, it can do any of those things, and you can mix and match them however you want. So it made it much easier to develop custom exploits. And even though Metasploit is not the only exploit development framework, it is certainly the most commonly used by both ethical hackers and foreign state actors when they're developing exploits as well. They'll often use Metasploit. So let's look at an example straight through from running Nmap to exploiting with Metasploit. So we're going to run Nmap. We're going to find a bunch of different ports and information. So we've seen this before, but the thing we're going to do differently is we're going to look for something we can exploit with Metasploit. In this example, as we scroll up, we notice that VS-FTPD 2.3.4 is listed. Now what we can do inside the Metasploit framework is we can actually type search, and then we can paste that information, and then it will come back with any potential exploits. Now we can see there's already a publicly available exploit in the database for that version of VS-FTPD. So now we can run the syntax of using that exploit. So you can see that in Metasploit that turns red. We have to do a little bit of syntax here. So one of the things we need to do is set the rhost variable, which stands for remote host. We do that by doing set rhost and then the IP address we want to target. So we can then show our options. So we can see we're going to exploit over port 21. We see what we're going to exploit, and then we just type in the word exploit. You can also type in the word run, and it will run that exploit. So you can see it went through, it was successful, and we now have a command shell on the computer. So if we type who am I, we can see we're root, we can background that shell, we can do a whole bunch of different things. So now we have sessions. So one of the things Metasploit lets you do is you can control all these various sessions to machines. So when you're hacked into multiple machines, you can organize all the different sessions you have between machines and run all these different payloads now that you have access. So that's an example of how you would go from using Nmap to finding a vulnerability and then exploiting that vulnerability. Now, that is not the only way to hack into a system. So it's not always via an exploit. Sometimes the way to hack into a system is going to be via dropping some kind of download. In this case, this is an example. We created a .exe file, and we're going to drop it on, we'll call him Bob's computer, and we're going to get access to his computer. So if we take a look here, so this is going to be Bob, and he's going to download our evil.exe file that we created. So you can see he downloads that file. So this would be just like if you downloaded any kind of software on your computer. It's good to note that these kind of files can be embedded in existing files. CC Cleaner had something like this embedded in it a long time ago, and it caused all kinds of issues. But now we're going to see that Bob goes to run this evil exploit we've created, and Microsoft will often warn and say, this may not be safe to run, and many people will just say run it anyway. So after that runs, notice that nothing else seems to happen on the computer. But on the back end, we have a command shell open. We have our session opened. So just like before when we exploited a system, that gave us access. Now we have access. So here's a second way you can get access to a system. This is what often happens with hackers. They'll get people to download files and click on something, or click a link and enter credentials. There's some way that the bad guy is tricking a user often into getting access to a system. Sometimes we see, like in our first example, there's an exploit we can use. Oftentimes it's this second one. And we can see in this example, we can do all kinds of things to their computer. In this example, I'm just creating a .text file that says I hacked you, right? So we can see that that shows up live on their computer, and that would be enough to scare anybody. So Metasploit is not the only, you don't have to use everything via a command line with Metasploit. You can also use a tool called Armitage. Now, Armitage is a GUI built around Metasploit. So all the same things we can do in Metasploit via the command line, we can do the same things in the GUI. So here's an example. From the host dropdown, we can run an Nmap scan. And then on the host, we can select specific attacks. So we can say find attacks. It's going to find different attacks that we can use, and then we can select different attacks and try them on various hosts. So Armitage can speed up our exploitation by quite a bit because there's more pointing and clicking. We don't have to look up and research things. So if you are not a fan of the command line, or you want to try using a GUI that might make your hacking a little faster or easier, you can try Armitage. Armitage also has the Hail Mary attack, which will throw every single exploit imaginable against a device to see if any of them work. I don't recommend using this on, especially on any kind of production system, but it can be interesting to see how a device responds when you throw basically the kitchen sink at it. All right, so that's the overview of week 3. We're going to be diving into these topics throughout the week, and over the next 2 weeks, we're going to keep going a little bit deeper. Next week, we're going to dive even deeper into malware and different types of malware, how people build malware. So some really exciting things happening in the class. Hope you enjoy this week. Thank you, and best of luck.